All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June 2025 meeting of the Study and Review Committee. I am Greg King, Chair. First order of business for today is approval of the May 22, 2025 Study Review Committee meeting summary. Can I get a motion on the floor, please?
So move.
We've got a motion. Do I have a second? Second. All right. Any changes, edits, updates to this content, guys? Mr. Marsh, is that you? Okay. All right. We'll move into a voice vote. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And opposed, like sign. And meeting summary is approved. All right. We're going to throw it over to Mr. Fisher for today's discussion.
All right. So before you today, you have the proposed regulations for data centers, which will be contained in Section 250-340. We've been hammering this now for, this will be the third month. Typically, most of our regulations, at least since I've been here, have been in SRC for about 2 to 3 months. So my goal today was to try to get you all a document that looks like a regulation, that sounds like a regulation, in hopes that this can get forwarded to the Planning Commission for the July meeting. I know there'll probably still be some things in this meeting that we'll want to discuss, and any changes that we make today, I've already proofread it a couple times and realized there's a few things that I missed. So any of those edits and changes will be conducted along with anything that you all may recommend today. So per the chairman, what we're going to do is just go down through each section of this document. And at the end of each section, if there's anything that the committee members have heartburn about or anything that we need to discuss, we can do it at the end of each section. So that first section that you have is purpose and intent. That's just really a general narrative as to what the point of having this regulation is. I will make note of the second sentence there, is that the regulations established herein are intended to define and control data centers to minimize their impact on surrounding properties, ensure compatibility, and promote sustainable development. The intent is to, and a couple months ago we had only, I think, 2 or 3 things there. And I will say this, you all have got 2 copies of this regulation in your packet. So one of them is a clean copy, the other has strike-throughs from what was in our previous meeting. So whichever one you like to look at, you can look at that one. So in there now we have 5 kind of intent statements of what the regulation is intended to do. The first one would be to protect adjacent land from adverse impacts, such as any visual light, noise, and air pollution. Number 2 is to ensure compatibility with other adjacent land uses and existing regulations. Number 3 is to promote renewable energy and green infrastructure. Number 4 is to provide proper notice to the community to promote engagement and transparency in the approval process. And number 5 is to provide for proper decommissioning and site reclamation to restore land to a usable, non-hazardous condition. So that kind of concludes that first little purpose and intent section. I will be honest, probably the only one out of those intent statements that I still have a little bit of inkling on is number 3, where promote renewable energy and green infrastructure, solely because there's not a lot of that in the document. But as I think about it more, I want to make sure that this document goes with us, or obviously when we create an ordinance, we want that to be something that 5 years down the road isn't outdated. And so as infrastructure changes and more green technology does come in, I think the intent of the ordinance, the regulation, would still be to try to promote those uses rather than anything else. So that's kind of the only one that I think I still have a little bit of, do I want to keep that in there or not? But I'll let you all hash that out.
All right, commissioners, any input?
Yeah, I have a question on point number 1, Ryan. Protect adjacent land from adverse impacts such as visual light noise. That sounds like a zero tolerance type thing. Could we look at wording of that, of manage, or some other way to say that it minimizes the impact or mitigates the impact?
Is on either, I don't know.
I'm just not talking into it, I believe.
Yeah, I understand that. So once again, keep in mind that these are intent statements, that a lot of this stuff is going to be covered further in the in the regulation. The point of that is we are going to have, obviously, lighting standards in the reg. We already have lighting standards in our regs. There's going to be noise stuff talked about in here later on with sound attenuation, with noise impact studies, things of that nature. And then obviously air pollution with the, Tier 4 generators being required and things like that. So the intent of the thing is to, obviously the reason why we have those in there are to protect those adjacent lands from those adverse impacts. So once again, this is solely just kind of a statement to say the intent of this regulation is to do these things. So, but I get it. I mean,
Mayor Black, short leash. We are not doing public input today, but come.
Sorry, I'm just here speaking. I know it was no input, but is there any way that even Ryan can present his presentation? Excuse me?
I don't know if that mic's on.
My question is there any way as Ryan presents his presentation, could he maybe put it on the overhead screen? So we could at least, see what you all are seeing. Would that be permissible or not?
Thank you for the question. We'll see.
Okay.
I'll let John be my
Thank you,
overhead
John.
person.
I heard your answer, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I do just want to make a note that I want everybody to understand that the document that's on the overhead is just a draft at this point. So this is still subject to changes by this body. This is still subject to any changes that could potentially happen down the road at Planning Commission. So as we're taking photos and we're posting this places, is that this is a draft. So I just want to make that known.
All right, Mr. Marsh, back to you.
I heard him. I'm good.
Good. You want to soften the edge on that? Call it mitigate instead of protect? Is that something that you wanted to pursue, or?
I want to hold on to that idea, and as he says, there's more stuff coming, so let's see what the rest of the document looks
Fair
like,
enough.
and we might come back to that.
Anyone
Thank
else? Katie?
So a couple quick, one primary thing, I think it's just semantics. Number 2 says, we already have it right above, says the intent is to, and then this one, just eliminate 2. We don't need it twice.
Thank you.
And then I think as we get through other details, there are some things that I'd like to go through more.
All right. So with that, sorry.
Good.
All right, so we'll move down to the definitions section. Now, last month when we met, I did have a question on what other kinds of definitions do we want to see in there, and I think your all's position last month was to just keep data center in there. And I was going to go with that, but I almost think because this regulation touches on a few of these other things as we go through, there are some other definitions that kind of became a little bit more important that we should put in there. Now, obviously, if decommissioning goes away, then there's a few of those definitions that could be struck from this document. So once again, as we work through this. So the definition of a data center. So I had a ton of meetings with individuals throughout the course of this. And this is probably, in the creation of this regulation, I've had more meetings with individuals from the public rather than how we typically do regulations, where we meet in this smaller room. There may be 2 or 3 individuals there, and we've got the ability to, hey, what are you here for? Do you have something to say? But I had a lot of different meetings with not only the public, but the Oldham County Health Department, met with Matt Rhodes, met with several other individuals on kind of what they would want in these regs. And so the definitions actually came from a member of the community that kind of talked about, the point behind his data center definitions. And so for the purposes of this reg, data center will be defined as a facility used primarily for the storage, processing, or transmission of data, which includes but not limited to buildings designed to accommodate computer servers, storage systems, or specialized computing hardware. We then have a definition for hyperscale data center, which is a data center as defined above that meets one or more of the following criteria. Total gross energy demand, actual or projected, which exceeds 50 megawatts at the maximum design capacity from any energy source, including energy generated on site by any means. Gross floor area dedicated to computing systems and support infrastructure that exceeds 100,000 square feet. And the facility is designed to operate as a regional, national, or global node in a distributed computing network, including but not limited to commercial cloud, artificial intelligence, or high-performance computing systems. So the numbers that that particular individual provided were a little bit different. So I changed those numbers, the 100,000 square feet and the 50 megawatts, to be consistent with what you'll see on page 2 in our chart for a large data center. So those numbers then for our definition would be hyperscale, would be anything that we're going to consider a large data center based off the chart you'll see on page 2. And then the other two definitions, which kind of come out of the decommissioning section that's been put in there. Decommissioning is the process of retiring, dismantling, removing, and restoring a facility after it ceases operation. And cessation of operations defined as the discontinuance, and I have put in there of data center business operations, or inactivity for a period exceeding 365 days. So those are, as of right now, the 4 definitions that are in the current proposed regulation.
All right, commissioners, content, comments, input.
Mr. Fisher, the hyperscale definition, if it does equal the large definition, why, I didn't see it anywhere else in the document. Why are we defining hyperscale data center?
I think because a lot of people think that it needs to be defined as a separate category because all data centers aren't the same. And so that we want to be able to define that this one, based on our definitions, is considered hyperscale because
We never reference it throughout the rest of the document. So is there a benefit here, or do we need to incorporate it where we have a large?
I think that goes back to your all's original comments last month, is that we just wanted to maybe keep data center in there. But like I said, after having conversations with several people, there's a lot of individuals that don't turn the lights out. Hold on.
That's my cue to quit talking.
No, keep going.
Okay. Any comments from anybody else on that?
Katie?
Well, the question is, maybe on that chart, is that a place where that definition, or that,
Hyperscale on the chart instead of large, because
right,
they are.
or both?
I would agree with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments this section, commissioners? Okay.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So I know we're going to get into, towards the end of this document, goes into those decommissioning, ceasing of operations. But my first question is, who monitors that process now when we have decommissioning regulations? How do those days start? How does that get determined? Who monitors it?
Well, the only thing we have it for currently in our regulations is cell towers. So since I've been here, we haven't had any cell towers be dismantled. So that's one of those things, like a lot of regulations in any law that we make, the question becomes, well, how do we enforce this? How do we do this down the road? And sometimes in the thought process of creating regulations, that somehow gets lost in translation, and that's something that as we go forth, we may learn that, and the thing is, our staff is not that big, so to know that we have the ability to go out and make sure every day. I will say a lot of our things come to light by citizens letting us know, hey, did you know they're doing this over here? Or this light is shining over into my, yard, things of that nature. And so,
Code enforcement kind of gets involved at
Yeah.
that point.
yeah, but once again, we've got one code enforcement officer, so it's,
This is only for data centers and cell towers. I understand that cell towers have some unique characteristics about them that we have to include that. Are the unique characteristics of the data center addressed later as to why we're addressing this? Or
I think they're addressed from the a place of the fact of the computer infrastructure, the electricity that's taken to these sites, the diesel fuel storage for generators. In conversations I've had, I know there's a lot of heartburn over the decommissioning part, solely because it's not something we require of others. And so a gas station at the end of the day can cease to become a gas station, and they may eventually remove the tanks from the ground. But as far as what type of remediation is required or site reclamation to take that from a gas station back to what it was previously. So I know there's heartburn among that. I wanted this document, and I've let, Mr. King know that I wanted this document to come out of planning and zoning with some things that we maybe still have heartburn about, but then those decisions are done so in public meetings, whether it's this committee or down the road with planning commission or down the road with the legislative body.
So, Mr. Marsh, that's a really good question, all right? And I think it's fair to say that not everyone has necessarily support for that particular provision, but as it moves forward, all we're doing here is making recommendations. We don't get to enact. We don't get to determine the content of the final product. We're forwarding a framework for consideration by the legislative bodies. And
Okay.
so we'll get there, and this consideration is one to be considered, as is all of this content, and may or may not make it through in its final product.
Okay. I think Ryan answered my question, and that if we're gonna say this, we've identified that something needs to be remediated, and it sounds like he has tried to identify those points and address those to the best of our ability right now. So I think he answered that in a good way.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right. Any further questions, comments, this section? All right, Ryan?
All right, if we flip over to page 2, the next section is zoning districts and location restrictions. So I do have a typo in here already. So permitted zoning districts, a data center located within Oldham County shall only be allowed in the C4, I1, I2, and IPD zoning districts, and only, I'm going to put only in there.
Excuse me. Could I have one more word, please? I'm just doing this. I'm not running the meeting, but however, the reason I said put it up there was for the folks to see here, but I'd like to ask them, because if you all take pictures of these screens and then you go out there and say to the public, well, this is what they said, now we're going to put all this up on Facebook, and that's whether you're for these or against them. It's up on the screen. I don't think it's fair to them, as Greg pointed out, Ryan, this is a draft only. So this is not set in stone, but if you take pictures of this, then you go out there and say, this is what they said today, I think that's very unfair to these folks here who are working on this. So I'd ask you to refrain from taking pictures. You can take notes, but if you take pictures, I think we're just asking for a lot of misinformation going out there as a draft, and I think it's only fair that we try to refrain from taking pictures. That's my request, and I hope everyone here will agree with me.
Thank you for your input, Mayor.
And I will I'll just piggyback on his comments, is that if and when Study Review votes to send this to the full Planning Commission, this entire regulation in its entirety, after obviously we make the edits that are required, will be on that Planning Commission website for the July, the August meeting, whichever one it decides to go to. So
Draft.
yeah, the draft,
That draft.
the proposed regulation will be on the web. So.
All right.
All right, so permitted zoning districts, once again, only allowed in C4, I1, I2, and IPD, and only after the approval of a development plan from the Oldham County Planning Commission. The contents of that plan shall include all items that are set forth in Division 390, site plan regulations, and include any required impact studies. So those impact studies will be talked about later on, those that could possibly be required. A couple changes on this from when we met last is we did add C4 in there, and that was something that I had thought about adding before, but I know because of the talk that we've had in the community since the original proposed location is about its industrial use. So I didn't necessarily want to put C4 in there, but after talking to actually a few individuals in meetings who are, I won't say they're anti-data center by any means, but to say that they could see some potentials where C4 could be allowed. And so those are going to be allowed in those smaller data centers that are only going to be 5,000 to 20,000 square feet that could potentially be ancillary to a hospital or something of that nature. Is that there's kind of talk that C4 could be an allowable district for those. Keep in mind, there's not a lot of C4 zoning in Oldham County. There's not a lot of industrial zoning in Oldham County. So this will have the approval of a development plan with the Planning Commission, which is a change from the previous. We had talked about going to the Board of Adjustments again, but we decided to take that out completely. So it would be a permitted use essentially in those zoning districts, but it would have to require a development plan to be approved through you all. There has been conversation that individuals on the legislative bodies would like to hear these because of the controversy around them. I think there's some members of the public that would like their elected officials to hear that. I did not put that in there solely because if it's a piece of property that is already zoned appropriately for what we've defined as data centers, whether that's industrial or C4, and it's already properly zoned, I just think that adds another step in there that is maybe unneeded. Now, I'll let you all hash that out. I'll let the legislative bodies hash that out. But if you think about the amount of land in Oldham County that is zoned appropriately for these, whether it's C4 or industrial, the chances of a zoning map amendment having to come before the legislative body is fairly great anyway. So they would get to hear that just like any other zoning map amendment. You all would hear the development plan, approve or deny that, and you all would recommend approval or denial of the zoning map amendment to the legislative body. So that's how I've left it at, is to not just automatically include the legislative body. It's something that could get changed, but that's the way we've got it right now, just because I think it bogs down the process for something that's relatively unneeded when it's already properly zoned. And then I'll just finish out this section. The classification of data centers shall be determined by the following, and we've got building size and power capacity there. I know there were a few things on that chart last month, but there's just a lot of difficulty in trying to determine a few things that were in there. So the chart does still classify the data centers as small, medium, and large. And I know we just talked about the large would be the hyperscale, so we can add that word in there on the chart. And you can just kind of see going down, the small would be allowed in anything C4 and greater. Anything 5,000 to 20,000 square feet, and that power capacity would be 1 to 5 megawatts. The medium jumps up to where it's only allowed in the industrial section, so now that takes out the C4 potential for a medium size, so you're only allowed in I1, I2, and IPD. That would be 20,000 to 100,000 square foot, and then 5 to 50 megawatts of power capacity. And then the last one is hyperscale, or the large, which would only be allowed in I2 and IPD. That's greater than 100,000 square feet and greater than 50 megawatts. An individual did bring up to me to maybe have a note, because as technology changes, could you potentially see 50 megawatts of power in a smaller building? And so they recommended to put maybe a note on that chart to say whichever is greater. So if down the road they're able to take a smaller building and put a ton of power to it somehow, I don't know. Is that we want to make sure that if it's let's just say it's a 10,000 square foot building and it's able to get 50 megawatts of power, then you're going to follow the large data center column and have to be required to go into I2 and IPD. So I think there's maybe a caveat there that we need to put a note on that chart to say whichever is greatest or something of that nature. I think that's it on that one.
Okay, input. Mr. Finney.
That goes back to how big this used to be.
All right. Mr. Marsh, go ahead.
Ryan, you skipped over the word appropriate there in the top. Approval of a development plan from the appropriate. Did you change the wording?
I took that out because it used to say the appropriate Board of Adjustments, since there's multiple Board of Adjustments in the county with LaGrange and Pee Wee Valley. So I needed that to say from the Oldham County Planning Commission because you all are the only one.
Okay, so TRC wouldn't be, it would have to come to the,
Yeah.
okay,
Yep.
I agree with that, thank you.
All right, Mr. Fisher, I've got something. So we make a reference in the definitions to gross energy demand, and then in this part of the discussion, we'll refer to power capacity. Are those the same thing? No, they're not. Can I get your name and address for the record, please?
Stuart Robinson, 2200 East US Highway 42, LaGrange.
Thank you, sir.
Power and energy are not the same thing. The very first slide that you put up where you said the energy demand was 50 megawatts, that's not the energy demand. That's the power demand. Power and energy are two different things. Power is a rate of energy generation. It's a rate. It's not an energy demand. Energy is measured in megawatt hours or kilowatt hours. When you pay your electric bill every month, you're buying kilowatt hours of energy. That's the difference between energy and power. The very first item you had on the list said the energy demand was 50 megawatts or whatever. That's not the energy demand. That's the power demand. And everybody's talking about megawatts as though everybody understands what megawatts are. The biggest commercial jet engine you can buy is about 85 megawatts power, and that's only generated during takeoff and climb. 85 megawatts. We're talking about 50, 100, 600 megawatt facilities. These are as big as a power generating plant. Why aren't they regulated like power generating plants? When they have to have their backup power, if they need 200 megawatts of power, they're going to be generating 200 megawatts of power. But they're not going to be generating that power just for 2 or 3 minutes like a jet engine off takeoff and landing. They're going to be generating it 24/7. So everybody's talking about these numbers as though everybody understands what they mean. These facilities are very large, very powerful, very high energy facilities, and they should be regulated as such. Heavy industry. A large commercial steel melting plant is about 500 megawatts. These are very large industrial facilities, but unlike steel plants, they don't employ large numbers of people, except when they're built. They only employ relatively few people, and yet they're enormous industrial facilities. I get very confused. But power and energy are not the same thing.
Thank you for that clarification. So, Mr. Fisher, I don't know if we need to consider what we're trying to say in both of those spots, and to align that potential language might be something to consider. And I don't have a suggestion.
This is why the more documents I get, the more it gets is muddy,
Yeah.
because everybody's got different terms, different numbers that
Right.
even individuals from the same camp have provided me. So
There you go. Okay. So,
welcome to my world.
further questions here, guys? Further comments? All right, Mr. Fisher?
Moving on?
Yep.
All right. Next section is building requirements and setbacks. So all of those building requirements and setbacks will remain the same as what's in the current zoning ordinance. And so everything that stands the same that is in C4, I1, I2, IPD, all of those requirements will remain the same. On the next page, there's a chart which shows you the minimum acreage, which shows you minimum lot width, maximum structure height, front, side, rear yard setbacks, lot coverage for structures, and maximum impervious surface. All of those numbers are taken from our existing zoning regs for that particular area. So instead of reinventing the wheel, all of those apply, except for one, and the way it's written in there right now is the bullet point on page 2. All structures, buildings, maintenance equipment, ground-located cooling, ventilation, or backup power generation equipment must be located at least 1,000 feet from the lot lines of all adjoining properties with any type of residential use. This measurement shall be taken from the actual structure, building, or equipment on the property and measured to the lot line of the adjoining residential. So it won't be from the property line of, let's say, the data center property. It would be from any buildings that are on that property. So if they're going to be set back off the property lines, that's going to give them extra noise buffer, extra buffer for lighting, extra buffer for security measures. So those measurements will be taken from those buildings to anything residential in nature. And currently, the weight we have in there is 1,000-foot setbacks. And I'll tell you, I once again met with individuals who wanted at least 1,000-foot setback from those residential properties, had conversations with individuals about noise-sensitive areas. I did not put that in there because the noise-sensitive areas that were discussed are pretty much everything. Parks, playgrounds, daycares, churches, worship schools, everything. And I know we'd mentioned schools last month on whether or not you all had an idea for larger setbacks from those. And I believe you all said that you weren't really in favor of that. So right now, the way it's worded in here is just all the setbacks remain the same for the zoning except for anything that borders residential. I'll say this too, is that there is, I know there's heartburn over this for probably you all that sit here, because there's not much that we have in our zoning regs that do have 1,000-foot setbacks. I told you all last month, solid waste transfer facilities is one that we have, and it's worded the same way in there as I've worded it here. So it goes from any building on that solid waste transfer facility property that they're using to the residential property. It doesn't go from the lot line. And along that note, I know people have brought up Oldham Reserve is a place where people have mentioned that, you know, these data centers should be located. If you're going to try to put them somewhere, there's questions that have come up of there's not only residential homes near Oldham Reserve, but there also have had approved a development for multifamily housing within pretty much the middle of that development. And so in doing so, do you then eliminate any possibility that something like this could go in Oldham Reserve? I say that to note this is that, once again, Oldham Reserve is a PUD. So they have their own approved master plan. They can choose to come back and amend their master plan to include data centers with their own setback regs. That still comes to you all to amend that master plan. If and when they do that, they could come to you all and you could either choose to approve that amendment to their master plan, or you could potentially deny that. That's completely up to you. So just keep in mind, for everybody's knowledge, is that that's a little different of a sense because it is a PUD. So they write their own regs, but those ultimately have to be approved by you all for any amendments to that master plan. So I think that's it on that.
So Ryan, what you just said there, if there's a zoning classification for residential, not necessarily a use, so would that better be worded something like adjoining properties with any type of residential zoning classification?
I could put that in there, yeah. Zoning class or use.
Or use, yeah. Thank you.
Bobby?
And are 4,000 square foot data centers regulated at all?
Bob, can you get a little closer to that mic? I can't hear you.
Are 4,000 square foot data centers regulated at all? Okay. It looks like it may be over-regulated for the hypercenters. I can see 1,000 feet from a residentially zoned area, not for an existing house in it, something that's zoned industrial. You're going to not allow any development of these industrial areas if you leave existing houses there.
keep in mind a little bit of the other reason too is, obviously distance on any setbacks is something that a variance could be requested for. Just lay that out there for you all to talk about.
Katie, do you have something?
I do. Few questions. So with the way it's written, do we typically do to the lot, building to a lot line, or in other regs, is it building to building? How has it been done in the past? And then do we do that maybe do we have that as this? Do we do it as a setback?
Well, setbacks are normally, when we look at those, would be, and we'll just make it simple. You want to build a house. There's a setback requirement in residential. You have to put your house 7 feet from the side property line. So typically it's from that building to the property line. In certain cases like this, where you've got potential facilities that may have noise or light pollution or even air pollution, solid waste transfer facility, I'm guessing a lot of that was written, smell, things of that nature. That one is written from the building to the adjoining property line, wherever that is. We had one solid waste transfer facility come through here since I've been here, and we probably had a 2-hour-long TRC meeting, and finally a gentleman got up at the very end. He goes, "I've got a house that's right there in these trees," and we were like, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, in these trees," and we were able to pull some images, and there was a house there. It was within 1,000 feet, and it was kind of like a mic drop moment at that point, because they couldn't do the solid waste transfer facility because it was within 1,000 feet of something used residentially. So this was from the building they were proposing to the location of that house. And so that one is written a little bit similar to how I wanted to write this one. But typically setbacks are, your place in a building, it's got to be a certain amount of feet off of your property line.
Okay.
This is more to maximize or minimize, I don't really know which word to use there, the potential impact to neighbors, and in terms of the residential use of that being a house, a place where you live, reside, sit out on the back porch, swim in the pool, is that if we increase those setbacks to that, now you've given more of a buffer. We can maybe have more trees planted, which will eliminate some noise, things of that nature. That was, I think, the point of people wanting the 1,000-foot setback. I will say, Loudon, Virginia, where we visited, they've been doing this a while. They actually told us in their recommendations when we visited up there, and that was minimum 500, but optimal is 1,000. And they've learned over time things to do better. And so they actually recommended 1,000 feet as well for any residential property. So we also got that from them.
All right, so dimensionally, 1,000 by 1,000 is about 23 acres,
Right.
okay? Just as a dimensional reference.
It's on each side. It's
Right.
2,000 by 2,000.
Exactly, okay? So just to kind of get some imagery on this. All right? Further questions, Katie?
Yeah, I go back to looking at as you mentioned, this chart on the next page, which I think we'll get to, but is pretty much all of the industrial C4 zoning regulations with one exception. The question is, when these were set in place with all of these in mind that are already approved, why do we need to do something different on setbacks and things of that nature? There are other manufacturing that are near residential. I live near one, and it makes noise, it has light, it does all those things, and it's nowhere near 1,000 feet from the residential. It's more than the setback guidelines, but why more, is my question. Where the 1,000, and I think you said 1,000 feet came from the sewer district?
Solid waste
Solid
transfer.
waste district?
And as well from Loudoun County,
Okay.
in terms of
Correct.
their regulations, just as a matter of best practice considerations.
And I'm just going to guess that if and when this goes to the planning commission, you're probably going to hear from many people in citizen comment that they would also like a 1,000-foot setback from once again, anything that is already zoned or used residentially. And I understand the heartburn that takes of there's already not a lot of industrial land. But if we're talking about looking for the optimal site for one of these, if the county does indeed have an appetite for something like this, then put it somewhere where it's not going to be intrusive to individuals who live and reside there.
We'll
But-
also have a good chance of hearing that 1,000 feet is too much. Right?
Correct.
And
With that, as you said, it's 23 acres. We're almost pushing this to a rural, larger place if we're requiring 23 acres
well,
plus, unless there's
I
a
think we're more like pushing it to an industrial zone
large
property
industrial zone
that
property.
has those dimensions is what I think of it. But there is a consideration about legislation that's passed if it cannot possibly be complied with in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Then you have a chance of losing that regulation altogether under legal challenge because it's simply just a de facto prohibition for what it's worth. So, reasonably implementable or its realistic chances of remaining on the books are very slim.
Can I ask a clarification question? I think you both alluded to this. So we talked about the residential use term, and we talked about maybe residential zoning, adjoining residential zoning classification and use. Well, so let me clarify. If, let's say it's zoned commercial, but they happen to have an old house there that's been used for years as an old house, but yet it's zoned commercial, or would that qualify
Yes,
under this?
correct.
Is that something we want to include? Classes, zoned classes and uses?
I believe that's what Ryan agreed when I said that, both zoned, currently zoned and used. So that would include it.
And we deal with that a lot on ordinance creation. We just went through medical cannabis, and there was things that it needed to be away from, and a lot of people would say residentially zoned.
Right.
And residentially zoned and residentially used are two very big different things. You could
Correct.
have an agricultural zoned piece of land that somebody may reside on. They may not farm it for a living. They may cut the grass and bale it, but as far as crop production, animals, they may not do that, but it's used residentially. Or like you said, there could be if you go out 146 towards Singleton Lane, there's all sorts of properties that are industrial zoned, but have for a long time been used residentially. And so I always just like to make that caveat because it makes our job in the planning office much easier when if it just says residentially zoned and you go, but I live there and I reside there and I want to try to sleep there, I try to make that distinction because it makes our job a lot easier to go, I'm sorry, we can't do anything for you because you're not residentially zoned, even though you're using it that way.
Okay.
Couple comments on the structure here, Ryan, real quickly. I might be jumping ahead of myself, but when we talk about the 1,000 feet and all that, the page after the chart in location, screening, sound attenuation, point number 4, again, I think says that redundantly. Ground mounted equipment shall be located on a yard furthest away from the type of residence not permitted adjacent to a property zoning district. Is that different in your mind in some way?
A little bit, and I'll get to that section on the reason why that was written in there that way.
That. And then in the chart itself, why are we including agricultural structures are exempt? And can we clean that up, or does that need to be in there for a particular reason? Are we expecting agricultural structures to be under data center building requirements?
We can take that out. When I had staff write that in there, I said, just give me what's in the current zoning regs. That's in the current zoning regs, but we can take that out.
Up a little bit. Perfect. Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else? All right, Ryan, back to you.
Mr. King?
Yeah,
Question from the floor if you want to entertain that, but
briefly. Right here.
Thank you. Previously, you, Chairman, had mentioned having more restrictive.
Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Name and
sorry.
address.
Amy Wellborn, 3404 Shady Dell Boulevard, LaGrange.
Thank you.
You had previously mentioned wanting more restrictive regs for something, and it's easier to pare back in like a special use application than it is, to put in less regulation now and be bulldozed over. I'm just, in my opinion, I mean, for some reason, we took out AG, which should be the same as residential. And it feels like this is getting watered down some, so I'm
Thank you.
just concerned.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ryan, back to you.
I think we're on page 5 now, maybe. Building aesthetics and appearance. I think we've already pretty much covered the chart, so. Oh,
Hang on.
Actually, I got a couple quick questions about the chart. When you look at I-2 and then it goes over to IPD on maximum structure height, I notice it goes from 50 to 45. What's the story there? Or
that's
thoughts?
what's in our current zoning
That's
regs.
what's in
Okay.
the zoning classification at the
Okay.
time, yeah.
That is a good question, though.
Well,
Okay.
and the other question,
Question.
yeah, yeah, okay. And then, is it, on that same category, it says side and rear, is that and or is it truly should be and?
I believe it's worded as and
Okay,
on those increases.
okay,
And once
So-
again, that's another thing with data centers that makes it difficult is because we wanna regulate the height, but then we also want to regulate the setbacks.
Right.
In order to make something profitable isn't maybe the good word to use, but if you want to increase the setbacks, you almost have to have an allowance for an increase in height of some matter for them to be able to get the square footage of what they need. So it's difficult when you try to regulate, and that is nice about the I-2 and the IPD is it allows for increased setbacks will allow you to have a increase in height. It's tough to do both and. We want large setbacks and we want to keep your height real small. Well,
okay. Yeah, just wanted some more background.
right? Building aesthetics and appearance. I won't talk much about this because the whole intent of all 5 of these is to not make this look like it's a metal-clad industrial type building. Once again, Loudon is a good example. A lot of those buildings looked like office buildings. They had fall windows. They had an entrance that was either recessed or set out from the building that was glass, that it looked like an office building. If you go to River Ridge Commerce Center in Indiana, a lot of those buildings, the fronts of them where you enter look like office buildings. Now, when you get to the back, you see the loading docks or the side or whatever, but the front itself looks like a nice looking building. And so a lot of these regulations, some of them were proposed from individuals in the community I talked to. Others, this comes pretty much from Loudoun County's regulations, or I looked at Prince George County regulations, Cass County. There were several different places that I looked at their existing regulations, and a lot of them have just appearance and aesthetic standards so that these don't just look like a metal-clad warehouse building. Because if you don't put anything in there like this, guess what they're going to do? They're going to propose, Mayor Black said it great one time when a Dollar General was coming, is he said, we want it to look like a Cadillac Dollar General. We don't want it to look like the Fiat Dollar General. I don't know which car company he used is the bad one, but he wanted it to look like a nice Dollar General. So it makes it difficult from planning and zoning side because we don't have a lot of architectural regs within our regs. So I wanted to make sure something was in there so that we go, no, it's written right here that you have to have changes in building design, faux windows, bushes out front to make it look like it's a nice building. Now, there's obviously I've gotten input of, well, if we put them in an industrial zoned area, you're making them have a really nice building and the one next to you is whatever. That's a question, but I wanted to at least be in there that these things have to look nice and have something to stand on when I go to tell them, hey, I need you to make this building look nice, because some people can go, well, it's not in your regs. Makes our job tough.
Well, and that's my question, is who determines what is aesthetic? My opinion versus Greg's opinion might be very different, and so who determines that? Where, does it need to be more black and white than gray?
And it's a consideration for those downstream from us. I think it's just, if it's there, if it needs to be stripped out, it needs to be stripped out, and maybe a determination that's made later. If it needs to be bolstered with additional reference. All right.
A lot of this stuff, I'll tell you too, is covered in, when we meet with individuals for a pre-application meeting, these are things that we discuss with them prior to them ever coming in and filing. When they go, hey, we're looking at this site, it's zoned this way, can we do blah, blah, blah. We can then take this and say, listen, if you're coming, before you get to the planning commission, you're going to have a building that meets these regulations. You're going to have to show these plantings on your landscape plan. You're going to have to show, elevations to show where those changes in dimension, and that it not just look like a metal building. Because like I said, if you don't put them in there, then they're going to make it look like not that there's anything wrong with those metal industrial buildings, but.
Opinions vary. Bobby?
For appearances typically in the past, like on houses and stuff, that's done through deed restrictions, through the homeowners association or the development itself. We haven't, in the past, I believe, regulating appearance.
All right. Anything else, guys?
The enforcement of this again would be code enforcement?
Well, hopefully the enforcement of things like this would happen prior to that building being proposed. That the enforcement arm would be, your building has to look like this. We tell you that in the pre-app, and by the time it gets to you all for development plan approval, this wouldn't be something where I think they would build a building a certain way and then come in overnight and take down all the faux windows and change the building design to make it go back to look like a metal warehouse building. I don't think this would necessarily become a code enforcement issue. It would be more of a regulatory stance of, we tell them this up front, that your building has to look like a Class A Cadillac building, in the words of Mayor Black.
Mr. King, so when this comes up to us in commission, and we're looking at the plans, the development plan, we are to take and start counting numbers of bushes and looking at that to compare how this works when we're holding a hearing?
First of all, an application screening process for metrics like that are considered, okay? And, in a current environment, if you have an application with a landscaping requirement, for instance, that's not going to be something that you consider at the preliminary plan hearing. That is going to be a detail that is seen to downstream with applicant and staff to ensure that they've met the requirements of the landscaping regulation. But then otherwise, and in general, when it comes to items of discretion and judgment, that is for you to wait in the hearing itself based on the testimony and evidence that's provided on the record. It's up to you.
Okay.
And keep in mind too, in your planning commission hearings for development plans, you all have binding elements. And in those binding elements, a lot of times is shall comply with landscaping regulations. A landscaping lighting plan is required. That happens downstream at staff level, that we ensure then that the landscaping plan is met. We ensure that they've got the mix of evergreens and shrubs and grasses around that entrance. Staff ensures that, as well as a lot of times those binding elements include that the plans shall comply with all of the regulations in section 250-340. That's what holds them to the fire to say, listen, Your plan was approved on that day saying that you'll comply with this, and we've got regs in here that dictate that. So if and when they choose to try to play hardball and say, well, we're not going to do that now, that's once again, that comes back to your plan approved at that hearing was that you'll comply with everything. If we don't put anything in there, they're going to go, well, my plan is going to comply with what's in this section. And if it says we have nothing, guess what they're going to do? They're going to do nothing. Unless they're nice and say, okay, yeah, we'll do that. But most developers will push back a little bit on things that cost money for them to do with it not being written.
Thank you.
All right. Katie, good? All right. You guys good?
I got a question.
A question down here, sorry.
So number 4 talks about principal facade, and it uses facade in multiple locations. And I understand where we're going, but is principal facade would that be street facing? Is that the entrance? How do we define that?
To number 1,
Yeah,
the principal facade applies to all building facades that face
public road.
existing and or planned public roads or property with adjacent residential use. So anything that faces any of those, so if it's next to that residential, once again, to make that a building that looks like something that's nice. So anything facing the public road, the main entrance, or anything facing anything used residentially.
Okay,
The hardest part of that whole section was to determine whether or not principal in this case was LE or AL. I think it should be LE, but everything I read has AL. So if there's any English majors out there, somebody let
Right.
me know which one that is, because that was maybe the editor of the Old American let me know that. So that was the hardest part.
so on 4C, is that individual facade, is that the principal facade or just any facade?
So those would be any principal facade. So the principal facade of every building must incorporate the following standards every 150 horizontal feet, and that includes A, B, and C.
Okay,
So that means the back side of the building that's going to house the loading dock, we don't need it to be dressed up and make it look nice. It's got loading docks. It's got the generator yard. It's got all of the things that nobody wants to see, like how my mother cleans the house, when companies coming over. We put all that stuff in the one room, and we act like the house is real clean. Hope she's not watching this.
can we maybe change that instead of saying individual facade, clarify principal again?
Does
that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, so take out individual and put principal.
Yeah.
That's with an A.
Not an LE.
Yeah.
All right. Good guys? Okay.
All right.
Name and address, please.
Thank you. Garrett Ackles, 4008 Oak Ridge Drive, Crestwood, Kentucky. I'm curious on the building square footage. On the small, it's 5,000 and above. Does that mean that if it's 5,000 or less, I think you may have asked this, Bob, that it wouldn't be regulated? And is that square footage cumulative with all buildings on a site or per building? Question being, it'd be possible for somebody to come in and say, I've got 25 4,000 square foot buildings that I'm going to put on this location, and make the argument that those are not regulated because they don't exceed the 5,000.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So the second part of his question is that would be cumulative. And we have people try to do that all the time with small outbuildings, and they're like, oh, well, these are all, I've got a bunch of 100 square foot buildings, and I'm going to, the first part of his question is the way this classification chart is set up is pretty much anything that's less than 5,000 isn't necessarily regulated by this standard. Now, I don't know if there's many data centers out there right now that are, once again, if we define them as it's primarily being used as a data center, are less than 5,000 square feet without them being a room inside of a building that houses the computer servers. But once again, something that's primarily used in a data center-like capacity, at least what I've seen, is that most of them are going to be greater than 5,000 square feet. And now we can put something in there that talks about less than 5,000, but essentially it wouldn't be regulated by this particular regulation. You're going to show me your phone again, aren't you, Sam?
Well, you know, and I'm not trying to be, funny, but like Bob said, and Bob brought this up, but back when I was at UK, back in the early 70s or late 60s, the capacity of this phone, the computer that was at UK at that time, would have filled this room. Literally, would have filled this room. And it wouldn't have had the capacity what's in this phone. So what would 4,000 square feet, hold as far as capacity in the future? And that may not be the very distant future. So you might need to think about that.
Question along those lines. Ryan, if the hospital said they needed to increase their server capacity and they wanted to put a building, if they had land there, and they wanted to put a 4,900 or 49,000 just beneath the threshold, would that be an industrial or commercial? How would we view a server building of the smaller size to that? How would we view that right now? Where would you slot that into a classification?
I mean, right now, they was zoned appropriately for whatever, then they would utilize that as just what the building code requires. So there wouldn't.
Industrial or wherever they're at, or? So it is regulated. It just would fall into one of the general categories.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
All right, good guys. Okay, Ryan, back to you.
All right. Location screening and sound attenuation of mechanical equipment is the next section. So mechanical equipment can be ground mounted or rooftop mounted. All data center mechanical equipment has to be shown on that submitted site plan. All ground mounted equipment up to and including any generators, fuel storage tanks, and utility substations are prohibited from the front yard. So everything has to be behind the front facade of the building. We don't want going down the road to see any utility substations, things of that nature from the front yard. Number 4, ground-mounted equipment shall be located on a side farthest, and if I need to reword this, I can. I don't know if I'm real happy with the wording, but shall be on the side farthest from any type of residential use and is not permitted adjacent to any property with a zoning district permitting residential use, an existing residential development, or residentially used property. And the point of this is that, and some of this comes from citizen input, some of this comes obviously Loudon, who's learned something from doing this, is that to put all of that equipment in the back or farthest away from anybody residential. Is any of the loading docks, and I don't really mention loading docks in the building aesthetics and appearance, but we want all of that stuff to be on either the back side of the building or enclosed. If you're putting multiple buildings, you could do them in a U-shaped fashion to where then all of that stuff is housed within the middle of the property. So once again, that provides shielding from adjoining properties. It provides another method to eliminate some of that sound from possibly coming across property lines, things of that sort. So that's the point of the way number 4 is worded, is we want that stuff farthest from any of those potential uses. All data center equipment, mechanical equipment shall be fully screened on all sides from all existing and planned public roads, as well as adjoining parcels utilizing a mixture of screening materials, berms, or landscaping. That solid screen shall be constructed with the design and materials, details, and treatment compatible with those used on the closest principal facade, so that it's not some crazy wall that doesn't make any sense to the rest of the building. Number 6, mechanical equipment requires sound dampening barriers that are a minimum of 10 feet in height or a minimum of 2 feet above the generator height to try to enclose all of those. Screening walls for data center mechanical equipment may be perforated to allow for the ventilation of that mechanical equipment. And in number 8, screening for roof-mounted mechanical equipment shall be screened by a parapet wall equal to the height of the tallest rooftop unit and should be designed to blend with the architectural styles, materials, and color of the building. And this is something that a lot of facilities we went and looked at in Maryland incorporated. There was one of them that had the same color scheme, and it really looked like a Walmart. I was like, is that a Walmart? But it wasn't. It was a data center, but it looked like a Walmart. It had the blue and kind of yellow colors. The wall, the parapet wall around the top was blue that matched the facade. And so, once again, those are those kind of architectural regs, as well as sound attenuation devices to kind of minimize the sound from any generators or cooling units, things of that nature, and that they should look like they match the building.
All right, questions, discussion?
Please. Mr. Fisher. Okay, point number 4. I suggest where we have located on a side furthest, we use side as a term meaning sides in setbacks. So if we can, an elevation or, something that includes the back. You kept mentioning the back, but it looked like that was excluded the way we have it worded. Follow me? Thank you. Mr. King?
Thank you. Anyone else? Katie?
So number 5, all data center mechanical equipment shall be fully screened on all sides. Could we just summarize that, the remaining of that says something to be consistent with the building design material? So it blends with the building design proposed? The other question I had was number 6 talks about sound dampening barriers, minimum of 10 feet or minimum of 2 feet above the generator height. Should we say, like we did in the other part of this, whichever's greater, or something to that effect? Like, how do we determine which one they would use? Is it important to?
I can put that in there, whichever's greater. I think the point is the recommendation that this was provided me is we want to make sure that the generator is concealed. So if we just say minimum of 10 feet and the generator height for some reason is 15, that needs to be
Greater of.
Greater.
greater of.
Okay. And kind of crazy question. So we talked about we're trying to dampen the sound on number 7. May be perforated, but will that dampen the sound if it gets perforated? So it can breathe, but then will that dampen the sound? I don't know.
I think there's ways for them to do that where it doesn't really allow for the sound to come out, but it does allow for the heat that's generated by the generator to be able to escape and not be in that enclosed area. So again, I don't design mechanical walls or anything like that for a living, so I can't really answer that, but I know there's a way.
Familiar with that too, Katie. There is a way that
Okay.
we do that with air conditioning units and such in commercial buildings.
Okay. And then my last question on 8, but talking about roof-mounted mechanical equipment, will that roof-mounted equipment be accounted for in their height restrictions? Or will it just be the building height? Or if they put something on the roof, then does that count?
The parapet wall is usually included in that building height. So.
Those are my questions.
Good?
Yep.
Okay.
Ryan.
Anyone else? Tom?
Ryan, I would maybe suggest the perforated, that's one option. Maybe you change that, maybe designed to allow for ventilation in the mechanical equipment. make it a little bit more open, because it's, a lot of times it's an overlapping system of slats. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah. Name and address, please.
Don Erler, 4005 Old Highway 53, LaGrange. One thing that's not addressed in this section at all are the transmission lines. They should all be underground, and the substations should be fully screened and protected coming down. Again, just to reiterate, these are huge industrial activities. These are not airbrushed facilities that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Bobby, go ahead.
I'm assuming this will probably be in a heavy industrial area.
Here.
Come closer to that.
I'm assuming this is probably going to be in a heavy industrial area. Okay.
Right?
Industrial classification.
Sorry, Mr. Marsh?
I was just asking him that question. Did
Oh,
you
okay.
ask Mr.
Well,
Fisher?
this is very speculative
Yeah,
for us
right,
to try to answer that. Maybe, you know. I don't know. Okay, Ryan.
All right. So the next section is generator regulations and testing requirements. First one there, and I still don't know if I'm happy with the wording of this. Backup power generation using diesel fuel or battery energy storage systems using graphene are permitted on all data centers within Oldham County. Natural gas turbines for primary power generation are prohibited. And so there was one particular site we visited in Loudon that was completely powered by natural gas turbines. And it literally sounded like a jet engine constantly. So that was one that we knew right off the bat that we didn't want that. Now the question would be is, can these backup generators be powered by natural gas? Those would be obviously used only during, you'll see that in a second, only used during testing and in the event of a power outage. So once again, I don't know if I'm real happy yet with the wording of that. It's better than it was before, because one particular individual reminded me on my use of the word fossil fuel and that I was incorrect in how I worded it. So the other thing too is whether or not we write something in there encouraging, possible solar to be, a lot of times they'll use either the battery energy storage systems or solar power for that gap between when the power goes out and when the generators kick on, because these facilities can't lose anything. Like when you're working on a very important paper in college and the power flickers and you didn't save it on your 3.5-inch floppy disk back in the day and you lost everything. These facilities can't have that, and so a lot of them will use either those battery energy storage systems, well, that's a tough word to say, or solar power to make sure that there's not a gap there. I don't have that listed in there, and I think if we go back to those original intent statements, the more we can encourage green infrastructure, things of that nature, maybe put that in there, but I'll leave that with you all for a second. Backup diesel generators shall be a minimum of Tier 4 or the highest standard available at the time of application. So currently, the EPA, the highest level of standard on any of these generators to limit emissions is Tier 4. Done some reading that in Europe, they're coming close to coming out with a Tier 5, but that's actually the equivalent of what we have as Tier 4, and there's not a whole lot of push that's going to increase. But I wanted to make sure that if we wrote this regulation, that if in 8 years they come out with Tier 5 technology, that then the applicant doesn't come in and say, oh, no, it says Tier 4. So Tier 4 right now, or whatever is the highest standard going forward. That way we don't have to come back and try to rewrite this regulation just because they come out with a new tier of emissions control. And that's based on the industry standard that's been developed by the EPA. Number 3 is except for generator testing or commissioning activities, generator use shall be limited to backup and emergency use only. Continuous generator use outside of power outages is prohibited. So there will be no use of diesel generators to power a building 24/7 unless a power outage occurs. Generators shall be tested no more than once per week per unit. And generator testing is prohibited only during the following times. We did change that a little bit because there was some input back on pretty much having 5 p.m. be the cutoff. So I think we moved, I think originally that was, I think between May 1st and September 30th was, I think, from 4 to 6, and we just backed that up to 3 to 5. And those are things, once again, in the binding elements. These data center companies know this ahead of time, that's when their generator testing can occur. So that's something in all of the companies we talk to, they're well aware of, that communities have these regulations and that they abide by those.
All right. Questions, comments? Mr. Marsh?
Yes, sir. Point number 2, the tier 4, you mentioned the EPA regulations. Is this new? Is this just Oldham County saying that it has to have the highest standard available at the time of application, or is that a common thing in the industry as well?
I don't know about, industry-wise. I know that's something that, once again, Loudon recommended, is that we have the minimum of tier 4, which generates more of that protection against emissions, whether it's from nitrous oxide or carbon monoxide, things of that nature. So they recommended that they be at least a minimum of tier 4.
And that's would be specific to data centers then, not anything else that we would put in that zoning industrial?
Correct.
All right, Mr. Marsh, anything else?
No, sir.
Good. Anyone? All right. So Ryan, I do. Katie, did you have something? Go ahead.
Okay. What are examples on number 3 of commissioning activities? Is that what is that? Initial start.
That would be in the event of an outage, that would, I'm not a great big fan of that word, but so you're only pretty much allowed to use them if you're testing them or there's a power outage.
Okay. And then number 5, why not just make this simpler and just say only between business hours of 9 to 5 or 8 to 5? Something just across the board. Why specify certain time frames of the year?
This is a well, not only did I get citizen input on this, but this is something else that's found in a lot of other county regulations that have data centers. A lot of the regulations in, counties in Maryland have this, where there's certain testing times. And one of the data centers that we visited in Maryland was like, yeah, they have to abide by that. There's different times for different times of the year. And he said, we're only allowed to test our generators in that period of time. And that is something, based on some of your other questions, is if one happens to locate in Oldham County and they're testing their generator at 9 a.m., that then becomes a code enforcement issue. We get a call from somebody that says, hey, they're testing their generators at 8 a.m., and we go and deal with that and remind them that, once again, it's in our regs and it was approved at the time of your development plan that you can only test during these times. So once again, that just provides us a little bit more control. I don't like to use the word control, but a little bit more control over when they can test those. When is a reasonable time to test those? And especially if you live near that, to know that they're not going to fire it up at 9 a.m. Some people might like to sleep in. I don't know.
Good. All right. So,
Katie,
Ryan, yeah, go ahead.
excuse me, Katie. It's my understanding also that there are EPA recommendations of when to do some of this stuff, like out in Los Angeles, smog control and stuff like that. It could be, if we pull this from other places, it could be related to something like that. We should maybe do a little more research to.
Yeah, I like that
Yeah,
idea.
I don't think we're going to confuse ourselves that any of this would trump EPA regs.
Right.
So,
Right.
all right. But with that in mind, and in general, this section is something that I interpret as meaning hey, I want to try to establish some guidelines for noise and emissions. Well, we already have some noise references baked into this section. Is this needed or not, I guess is the question that I have. I'm not necessarily opposed to the inclusion of it, but the whole point of this is, hey, I want to be cautious about noise and emissions. I'm addressing the noise in another spot. That's the whole point in saying don't have a natural gas generator, for instance. If technology advances, and now it makes sense to have a natural gas generator because it is functioning at a quiet enough level to fit into this space. Is that preferable to diesel or some other source? I don't know. But, you know, the whole point is we're trying to chase noise in this discussion, and we may not decide to keep it. I'm not here to strike it just yet, but it may be something that we decide is not necessary given those objectives. Okay, thanks.
We ready?
Next up.
All right, next up is cooling requirements. This is a very short section. You know, this is something that could potentially be added to maybe down the road. But the first one is all liquid-cooled equipment must utilize a closed-loop system to prevent contamination of groundwater and other nearby water sources. That is fairly common in a lot of systems that they do use this closed-loop system. Please don't ask me to explain it to you because I won't be able to. And then number two is there's been a lot of talk, and I don't know if Alan Hayes is present in here today or not, but Mr. Alan Hayes has spoke at several different fiscal court meetings, if you've watched those, about a thermal energy district or a thermal loop. Some of that, when he talks to me, it does what a lot of my college classes did and go right over my head. But there's a lot of case studies of those thermal energy districts being used in Europe. There's not a whole lot of case study of used in America. So I think it's a neat concept. I didn't want to put that was something that's required. And what that does is it really takes the heat, it recaptures it from the building and is able then to pump it to other. Now, when I talk to them, this is just a personal thought of mine, is I could see that something could potentially benefit Oldham Reserve, a place that hasn't been built out yet, that if a data center was to locate there, you could utilize some sort of thermal energy district within that business park to then maybe attract other people to say, hey, bring your office building here. We're able to recapture that heat from this data center and to be able to then, lower cost, things of that nature. Once again, I think that's a topic we can continue to talk about that and investigate that. That could potentially be something that would be its own zoning regulation for a thermal loop district, but it's not really something in a planning and zoning regulation that we would want to get bogged down on. So the way I worded it is the creation or participation in a thermal energy district waste heat recapture is encouraged. So that's something that at the time of pre-application or even TRC, those things can be talked about of, hey, have you thought about this? Is there a way that this can be done? And to maybe start to encourage that down the road. But I think for what we know right now and the amount of material that we just have on data center zoning type of stuff, I really don't want to get bogged down in the thermal energy district talk, other than it being in there as we encourage you to take a look at this technology and see if it could be accomplished here.
Katie.
On number one, it starts out in black and white. All liquid cooling equipment must be utilized. It must utilize a closed loop system. After that, it's more like a statement of intent, which we do in the beginning. Should we just end it there and strike the remainder of the reasoning behind it?
We can do that.
All right, who else? Ryan, with respect to the thermal energy district, I think that's infrastructure that we need to build out before we nudge anyone in that particular direction.
I mean, are you okay the way it's worded now of we encourage that to at least take a look at that type of technology if that's something that,
It's non-binding as it is. I'm hesitant about being asked to construct a framework on upon an application, is my concern there.
we ready?
Yep.
All right, next section I'll touch on real fast because we already have landscaping and lighting regulations in our standards. So pretty much the first two just say that they're required to abide by what's in our current landscape and lighting regulations. The third one would be fencing. So fencing, a lot of times on these facilities, they're very secure, very limited access buildings. So that fencing shall be constructed around the perimeter as a method of restricting access and enhancing security. I'd originally put on there that the fencing could only be 7 feet, which is consistent with our regs. But then I got to looking and I was like, those regs actually only pertain to residential settings. So in order to kind of be a secure facility, you'd want those to be a little taller. So we have in there right now shall not exceed 10 feet in height. Now, C is kind of a question. Right now, what I have in there is permitted fence materials include wood, vinyl, aluminum, and iron. I know there's a lot of individuals that have told me that they would like to only see aluminum iron in there, that when you give somebody the ability to do a wood privacy fence in 20 years, what does that wood privacy fence look like? Now, obviously, that's something that code enforcement could get into on fence condition, just like he would with any other business that's not maintaining their property. But there's a question on whether or not we want to eliminate the wood option for these types of facilities. I don't think many of them are going to utilize that option because they want to have that security where they can still see out from the fence and not just a complete wood, wood privacy fence per se. And then the last one is we're not going to allow any chain link fencing and barbed razor wire. That's going to be prohibited. So it doesn't need to look like a jail or prison or anything like that. But we do understand that they do want to be secure facilities and have that ability.
All right, input. Yep.
I think you just ought to strike wood.
Strike wood.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't think we ought to even go there for that kind of fence.
Okay, Katie?
When it comes to LG&E and what do they require when you have electrical equipment outside, protection-wise, from a security, protecting people from it? Do they have certain guidelines?
I can't answer that question for LG&E, but I mean, I can just sit there and think about what's around a current utility substation. A lot of time is chain link fencing, barbed wire, but like I said, in these instances, really the entire facility is secured with perimeter fencing. I mean, there was no getting onto most of these facilities without having someone who knew you were coming, or individuals like in these co-location types of facilities where, they'll have key card access that allows individuals the right to get onto that property at any time during the day. A lot of them have guard shacks. Some of them were staffed guard shacks, some weren't. So, I mean, the intent is to make these as secure as possible.
Great.
What about vinyl on there too? That was another one I didn't mention. Are you all okay with the vinyl, or just go with aluminum and iron as being the options?
I doubt we'll see any vinyl either.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm good taking it out.
Let's go ahead and strike then.
All right.
Appreciate it. Barry Laws, 3411 Findlay Mill Road. Just a couple things. The sound, we kind of passed over that, or we can get back to that?
It's coming. That's
Okay.
coming.
Okay, just with all the generators running max. And then on the buffer, can we have 500 feet buffer before the fence? Otherwise, it's going to look like an institution. Thank you.
Any input, guys?
I mean, most of the buffer on these, I mean, you're going to have a parking lot that's between the fence. You're going to have berming that's between the fence. And the ones we saw in Loudon, they, you know, a lot of tree buffering, a lot of berming buffering, which I kind of got a chuckle out of because I watched Dukes of Hazzard as a boy, and I would think that that berm would just allow you to jump right over that fence. At least that's the way they used to do it back on that show. But berming, fencing, and then a parking lot as well. Now, once again, that provides a setback. It doesn't really, to Barry's point, provide any sort of buffering, rather than the berming is more for security. The trees are obviously aesthetic, a little bit of sound, but as far as a buffering requirement that would help with the sound, that is something we talked about. But once again, do you make it if we're looking at adjoining residential, do we make it 1,000 foot and then an additional 500 foot buffer, which makes it 1,500? Do we want to, within that 1,000 foot buffer, 500 of that has to be a buffer? I mean, I think that just gets into more heartburn among people saying,
It's essentially nowhere, right? That's almost unenforceable at that level is my initial take, but perhaps not. I'm not ready to take that up.
right.
Okay, further comments, discussion?
All right. We'll flip over to the next page because I really think the order of this makes more sense if the next section is the security one, because we go from fencing, and as I read this, I'm like, let's don't get into the required impact studies yet. Let's at least do the security. So on the next page over, there's one blurb about security, and that's based on some citizen comments, is that any type of video and or audio surveillance or drone security has to be restricted to their property boundaries, that there's concerns of individuals that are next door that any of that security that they may have would infringe on adjoining properties. So we wanted to make sure that that was in there so that it was known that any security you have has to be limited to within your property lines, whether or not they're using drone, video, audio surveillance, any of that nature. So I think that section makes more sense after the fencing. So,
Okay. Discussion? Questions? Go ahead.
I think
Name and
Rob
address.
Houchins,
Name and
1400
address, thank
Jaeger Lane. Sorry about that. I forgot until. I think the 500-foot setback with the fence and what you're looking at now are related. And so part of that is they're talking about very large drones. That if they went clear out to the property line, I don't know about you guys, but I love to sit on my deck in the evening. And part of what we're talking about there is if you have the fence line clear out that far, if the fence line was 500 foot back, then you have the drones also could be 500 foot back. So you don't have, because we're not talking, sometimes they could be little drones or they could be really big drones, and they could have different noise levels. So remember that drone is the other part that we're talking about here. And especially if you're looking at government facilities or things where they have government information, that might actually be part of what's been proposed in some places about having drones be a requirement for government facilities if they've got data stored in those places.
Right, thank you.
all right, we'll move on to the next section, required impact studies. So that's just below those pictures there, the fencing requirements. Several different impact studies, and I really wrangled with this section a lot on what we would have is to be required and what we would not have necessarily be required. So I think we can all agree noise is a concern. I mean, you've heard it several times in just citizen comment alone of the talk of noise, whether that's from their normal operations or whether or not that's from generators. Loudon also recommended this, is that we do noise impact assessments, both pre and post-construction. That is something that they've seen over time that is required there. And so if you see the noise impact study, a pre-construction and post-construction noise analysis is required for all data centers. So that is the one that no matter what, is going to be required for those pre and post levels. This analysis does have to be conducted, signed, and stamped by a certified or licensed acoustical engineer. I did actually call to make sure this was an actual position that somebody did employ. There's not a lot close to here, but there are such a thing as acoustical engineers. So that would have to be done by them. The required noise analysis shall ensure a maximum of 55 decibels at the property line And I added in for no greater than 15 minutes because the question would be is if they do a noise analysis study and it pings to 65 real fast and then comes back down, the generator testing is going to be limited to 15 minutes. We understand when the generators are running, there's going to be noise and it's going to be greater than 55. There's other conversation that talks about just general noise, and if you think about putting these in industrial property, and we'll just take, for instance, the proposed site they have on Sourback property, right now is, you're next to a power plant, you've got a train that comes through, you've got highway noise, and you've got noise from commerce. So what exactly is that level now at the property line? And so that's really what that pre and post-construction analysis will be on, the difference between what was there pre and what was there post. And are there things then in order to limit their noise from the data center to be 55 at the property line when what is the other noise around the property? So these are things that are very difficult, and it's going to be something that you all at development plan approval are going to have to listen to evidence and testimony from both sides. But it is something we at least wanted those numbers there to say, are you going to locate on 53 where right now there's nothing out there but noise from Highway 53? Or are you locating somewhere that we would think of as being a more preferable location around other things that are already generating some levels of noise? And then D and E just kind of really go into the nuts and bolts of that study. They're going to have to show us where, those testing locations were, what they were at that time of the day. Were they done when the natural gas generators were on at the Dynegy plant or whatever they call it? Was it done when a train was coming past? Was it done in the middle of the night? Was it done at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with interstate traffic? All of those, very similar to what you all see with traffic analysis, is they show you this is when the test occurred, this is what it showed, and because of this, this is the mitigation that this particular facility has proposed to do to minimize that noise. So that's the first one. The second one would be a traffic impact study. Jim Stillman with the county engineer's office does a great job at looking at the particular use in that ITE traffic manual. Those normally are required to then have that traffic assessment based on the trip generation at the peak hour. We know going forward, a lot of talk has already been done about, the amount of people that are employed at these data centers full time. So a lot of that isn't going to require any sort of traffic improvements. There is some concern about the amount of traffic that comes in during the construction phase, and would there potentially be some sort of traffic that needs to be generated during that? So the way I wanted to word that in this reg is that pretty much a traffic impact study may be required after consultation with the Oldham County Engineer's Office. I didn't necessarily want to say anything more than that, other than we may make you go and do this based on either your trip numbers or concern about trip generation during the construction phase. Environmental impact studies already.
Hang on.
Okay.
Okay.
Because they're kind of similar, I wanted to pause there and ask a couple questions. On the, when we're looking at a licensed acoustical engineer and they provide the data, I think a lot about, like you said, the traffic impact study we get, and it has, when those reports are done, are they similar? They say, hey, this is an A through F. These are our recommendations based on that. What does that look like? Will Jim Silliman look over that and make determinations? Does he do that like with the traffic impact study?
Right.
What happens with that?
I don't know if he's got experience in that field or not. I mean, this is something that, once again, we're right now, and in this state and in any zoning regulations throughout the state, we're kind of flying blind on what these studies even look like. I do know there's an individual in Louisville that does this as far as noise analysis from a safety perspective. He runs a safety company. So that may be, some questions that we can still get from him on what these look like, how they can be assessed, because if the applicant is the one tasked with doing these, like sometimes with traffic studies, they come in, they have paid that particular individual. But I think that's for you all to kind of then be able to ask those questions based off of that study. It gives us a tool and a resource at least to be able to start to ask smart questions at the development plan level to say, hey, these noise studies indicate this, to ask the question. But as far as what one looks like, who potentially from our office could look at those and have it make any sense, I don't know if I have a good answer for you on that,
Okay.
unfortunately.
And you mentioned it, when we look at C, where it talks about noise analysis and its max, when you have existing noise, how do we measure what would be allowed or permissible for a proposed site?
And once again, I think this is just something that is going to give you all some evidence to look at the hearing to say, listen, if, once again, hypothetically, you're going out to an agricultural piece of land that there's not a lot of noise. There is 25 decibels right now, just based off roadway noise. Post-analysis then shows you're putting 65 at the property line. Well, what are you going to do, to mitigate that? Or is it already putting off 65 at the property line just based off of everyday noise? So then they can try to then show that to prove that, listen, they're not going to go above and beyond that, similar to the traffic stuff. But once again, it just provides you all a tool.
It seems the analysis would be for the benefit of the builder, because he's going to get fined if he exceeds 55. So it's his benefit. We just want to see it.
All right, anything further, guys?
All right, environmental. A lot of this was worded off of our existing subdivision regulations that already potentially could require some sort of environmental testing. So that wording of that is generally out of that, and then that the zoning administrator may require that environmental assessment if you are in environmentally sensitive land, as well as include mitigation factors for that. And then the last one is a health impact assessment. This has been one that's been a concern for a lot of individuals. And so we had conversations with Matt Rhodes with the health department and kind of what they're looking at as far as a health impact assessment. And in our conversations, we really talked about, not necessarily putting it in as a requirement right off the bat, because once again, if Baptist Health is putting a small facility on their property that's going to be used as a data center, is that something the health department would require a health impact assessment versus an 8-building facility like we saw the one proposed on 53, where the health department could potentially say, we need you to do a health impact assessment. So we talked to him about getting the health department a little bit more involved in the TRC process. Like right now, we know Charlie Ward comes there and talks about it from the septic aspect, but in facilities like this, probably getting Matt a little bit more involved to at least come and give a statement from the health department to say, we'd like a health impact assessment done on this facility. Now, there is conversation from the other side that says if there's not a benchmark that says you've got to have it based on these factors, it makes it difficult. I think there's food for thought there, is that if you look at it from the other side and we don't have, because traffic assessments are, if it is this many trips or more, it requires one. It takes all the judgment out of Jim Silliman, as opposed to the way some of these are worded, is it allows it kind of open-ended to allow either me or Matt Rhodes from the health department or Jim Silliman to say, oh, we're going to require it in this sense, or we're not going to require it in this sense. So from that aspect, I maybe don't like how it's worded, but I do think it needs to be in there that it could be a required step based on.
All right, so does the health department currently have framework for what is known as a health impact assessment?
They did talk about that. I wish Anna was here today because she's got a degree in public health, so she could answer this question far better than I can. But yes, he did talk that is a tool that they utilize.
So that's an actual design set of evaluations and so forth. If that's already in existence, then yeah, referring to that is fine. If this doesn't exist, then it has to be constructed. Right?
And all of these, with the exception of the noise impact study, are things that at the TRC level can be talked about. To have Matt there from the health department to be able to say this is going to be required. And a lot of that stuff can also be talked about at the pre-application phase as well of what types of impact studies may or may not be required for a particular development.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
Just one quick correction. Number 4, I think we needed to just say a health impact assessment may. Just add that word back in there.
I already did it. That was
Okay.
one of them I found.
Awesome.
Sorry.
And then on number 3, environmental, are there, and you might be able to answer this as well, do we have a soil map we use to identify certain things with properties? Yes. And should that be one of the resources and tools?
Charlie talks about that a lot when he talks about septic and what types of
Right.
soil. So there are soil maps. Once again, this was kind of taken verbatim what's already in our existing subdivision regulations. Environmental impact is, could be required in a subdivision development based off of that as well.
One more question. In our regs, sometimes it says as determined by administrator. Is that also director of planning? So which one, should we use one versus the other?
It's used both different ways throughout our regulations. Next year, when we go to clean up those, we'll probably clean up that language a little bit and make it something standard. Zoning administrator is more of the KRS term of how it refers to it. So that's probably the more technical name.
Yeah.
Okay.
All good.
All right, Ryan.
All right, notifications. 2 more sections here we'll hit. Notifications, at least one neighborhood meeting is required prior to filing an application for a data center. Right now, the only things that require an actual neighborhood meeting are a zoning map amendment, so a zoning change, or a preliminary subdivision plan. Even though a plan goes to TRC, not all of those are required to have a neighborhood meeting. So we wanted to put in here specifically that zoning change or not, you at least have to have a neighborhood meeting, and you have to notify, actually that's on number 4, so I won't get ahead of myself. But it tells then specific, regulations on that neighborhood meeting that it has to be conducted no later than 30 days prior to applying. And that is something that's required when it's required. I'll note that when it is required to have a neighborhood meeting, that does have to be supplied at the TRC application. If a neighborhood meeting currently is not required, even though it says that on the checkbox, they don't have to provide a neighborhood meeting just because they're going to TRC. It's only in cases where a neighborhood meeting is required, which by state law is zoning map amendments and preliminary subdivision plans, unless we require that they do that ahead of time. So in this regulation, it would be required for a neighborhood meeting, and then those meeting minute notes and everything, just like they would typically do for others, would be required to be submitted at the time of TRC application. So that has to be done at least 30 days prior. Number 3 is verbatim to what we require them to do at the preliminary subdivision plan, and that is they've got to give us the meeting notes and the agenda and any notes that were taken during that meeting. And then this particular one would follow the same restrictions that a zoning map amendment would do, and that is everybody has to be notified within 500 feet of the property line of the proposed data center. So everybody within 500 feet would be notified.
All right, guys. Input, questions? Mr. Marsh?
So Ryan, this is an additional requirement just for data centers, even if they go into the zoned areas that we're talking about, where other companies, if they wanted to go into one of those industrial classifications and staff could say, yep, you're good, this is where it goes. But a data center would have to go through the public meeting. So another power plant could go out there without having to have a public meeting. All the other industrial classifications, we're just putting this additional burden on data centers.
Correct.
Interesting. going to pass muster with council? I mean, is that's discretion that we can include in this as?
Yeah, I'm not going to try to speak
You
for
know, yeah,
council.
we're not lawyers, right? Okay.
But, at this moment, it's, hey, do I want to leave it for consideration or do I want to strike it?
Okay.
Okay? But duly noted.
Thank you. Do we have any information from Loudon or any other areas regarding this?
I don't think they had necessarily anything in there about notifications on their little pros and cons sheet. I don't believe so. My answer off the top of my head is no. I don't remember seeing anything in there about that. And I think a lot of the point behind that is, there's a lot of input and, definitely community outcry at this stage because it's a big unknown right now of what these are. And so to require that type of facility when this may potentially only come once or twice here, if it ever at all, power is going to dictate how many of these can come here, whether or not we can agree or disagree on there's going to be one or there's going to be 50. The amount of power that LG&E can supply is going to dictate how many could potentially come here. And our regulations are going to be dictated on how much industrial land we have. So unless everybody's going to be doing zoning changes to taking agricultural land to industrial, when we don't necessarily spot zone very often, if at all, are really going to limit these on between power capacity or energy capacity that LG&E can provide, as well as the amount of properly zoned land that these can even be located in. So to sit there and require an applicant to go above and beyond a notification so that people that live in a relatively close proximity, and I'll tell you, some of the recommendations I got were even farther than 500 feet. And I didn't want to go that route because 500 feet is what we require for a zoning change. That's the maximum level of notification that we provide. Now we know that the county does pretty good on notifying people through word of mouth and social media and things of that nature. So the chances of notice being done to people outside of 500 feet rather than the official notice is probably pretty great too. So.
Okay.
As you said, I guess my concerns are noted. So
Yeah. And, if it's
I
something you
agree
feel
with the
strongly
idea
about, we can talk about
of
it.
making sure everyone knows, and that there's public transparency, but putting the undue burden just on this classification seems like it
May
might be.
sound onerous.
So,
Yep.
thank you.
All right, Ryan.
All right, so the last section is decommissioning and reclamation of buildings and land. I know we had talked about last month of maybe not necessarily having an appetite to put this in here. But kind of based on some talks I've had with individuals, we'll put it in here and see what happens. And I think Amy said something, earlier, is that to start out a little bit heavier and through the course of time, like most bills we know, as they go through legislative bodies, get pared down, and we'll see what happens. But it's in here today, and we'll see what you guys say about that. So decommissioning and reclamation of buildings and land. The purpose is to ensure the proper removal of any equipment, infrastructure, and hazardous materials to prevent property abandonment, environmental degradation, and promote site reuse and restoration in accordance with community development. So the first one is a decommissioning plan must be submitted to Oldham County Planning and Development Services within 90 days of any permanent closure of a facility, or within 30 days of a notice of abandonment or involuntary shutdown. The decommissioning plan number 2 shows what all is required in that decommissioning plan. Number 3 is all data centers greater than 20,000 square feet in size shall be required to post financial assurance through a bond, letter of credit, cash, or escrow sufficient to cover the full estimated cost of decommissioning up to and including any equipment removal, environmental remediation, site grading, and restoration. That's something that Jim Silliman's office, as the county engineer, does currently with different types of projects. So I did consult with him prior to kind of writing this up, that is something that he's willing to do and look at. And then the financial assurance shall be reviewed and approved by the county engineer and updated every 5 years, or in the event of a significant facility expansion. So that's not necessarily we take out all the computer equipment every couple years and put new computer equipment in. If that facility gets upgraded at all in size, things of that nature, which most of the time would require it to come back to the planning commission anyways, that bond is looked at to see whether or not that is still sufficient. All decommissioning activities have to comply with Kentucky Department of EPA, federal and state hazardous waste laws, Clean Water Act, local watershed protection, stormwater management, and then all generators, backup batteries, cooling systems must be fully drained, dismantled, and disposed of according to Environmental Protection Agency and federal and state standards. A data center shall be considered abandoned if left non-operational for a period of 365 consecutive days without a proper and approved decommissioning plan. And then number 6, upon the finding of abandonment, so if they just skip town in the middle of the night, the county may do any of the following: notify the property owner or operator, utilize that posted financial assurance to initiate decommissioning and site reclamation on their own, or place a lien on the property for all unreimbursed cost. There was conversation about whether or not we would put in there an additional amount, because right now with our code enforcement ordinance, it's pretty much like you get a $125 a day fine, and then it jumps up to this, and it's very minor. On whether or not you would put something hefty in there for these companies to say it's like a $5,000 a day fine. I didn't want to go that route just yet, but we'll see what the appetite is first, I guess, for the entire decommissioning section, and then find out because we already have an ordinance in place for the amount that we impose on fines, and I get the fact that you go to tell, let's say, Amazon, we're fining you $100 a day. Okay, well, Jeff can probably pull that out in pennies out of his pocket or something and say, here you go. Whereas a local property owner that owns a house that's got grass that's too tall, that could potentially hurt their pocketbook, but a large company, not so much. So I have not put that in there yet, just because, I don't know. I'll just let you all talk about that.
All right. Input, questions? Katie?
I go back to the question brought up earlier for discussion and to make note of, that when we look at other industrial areas, are we adding more guidelines to one particular classification than any others within the industrial zoning or C4? My question is, when any other industrial or business shuts down, goes out of business, what do we do with those? How, when something, something closes, do we say, oh, take it back to the ground the way it was before you built? Or does someone else come in, like we saw Cherry House, and they're looking at other businesses coming in and utilizing what's there? We didn't have them take it back to the ground when the business closed. When there's issues with code enforcement, they're not maintaining this facade, they're not maintaining the structure, the land. Does that fall under code enforcement? And that might be a good suggestion of, are there fines related to residential versus fines related to business use to consider?
Right. So, from this perspective, that one's probably controversial in terms of how it meets support or opposition at the legislative bodies. And, from perspective, I'm speculating entirely here, but this probably arises from the Highway 53 application, which says, hey, we're looking for a conditional use permit as a utility on an otherwise agricultural site. And if that should go belly up, exactly what do I have? Do I have an industrial site now, or do I have something that can be returned to agricultural? I think that's the intent of what it's trying to get to there. And I think it needs to be considered. And I'm not convinced that it needs to be part of the ordinance, but it may be. But it does need discussion, is my take on it. So,
My thought would be that with the new comprehensive plan being developed, that something like this is for the entire industrial classification, not just for the data centers. Or anything that fits into the C4I categories has to meet these criterias modified. But it's something that is encompassing everything.
right.
Would that
Yeah.
fit?
Yes, and, you know, I guess my concern with applying comp plan provisions to this is their subjective, qualitative comments that I don't know provide for enough teeth, if that's the
Versus
intent.
the ordinance?
Yeah, and, you know, so I don't know. I don't have an answer on this. It's, I think, something that needs to be discussed and considered, and may or may not make it through. We'll see. Go ahead, Katie.
And I think just like we talked before, you know, when does 365 days start? It's great, there's a black and white, but how do we know when that starts? What's that date? Is it when someone complains about it? Is it from the date we know they officially closed the business, but they maybe didn't notify anybody? And it's discovered down the road. There's a lot of questions.
Do you impose a requirement that says we're notified when you shut down? You know?
Right.
So we're going to have to define shutdown
Yeah.
now,
We did put in the
among
front
other
page.
things, but it's a consideration.
We put in the first page the definitions, cease of data processing activities. I believe
Yes.
we should at least be consistent there.
It may not be too difficult to insert language there that says if that should occur, then you have a notification obligation to the administrator. Okay?
Yeah,
All right? What else?
that's it.
Okay? Ryan, I've got one thing, excuse me. So for parking requirements, under these circumstances, these are typically less traffic personnel intensive and so forth, and in the interest of having maybe a little less impervious surface development, we might consider dialing back on parking requirements, parking lot requirements under such circumstances.
So our parking regs are contained in a different section of the zoning ordinance. Those are typically, when we look at the use, now, this goes back to, right now, there's not something that says data centers. And so we would have to try to determine what class that fits, and there's always a minimum and then a maximum. That is something that if the developer or the applicant said, well, I need less than that because there's not going to be a lot of parking, they can ask for waivers from those regulations, either the minimum or the maximum. So I don't necessarily know if we need to reinvent the wheel within this reg, but have that ability to do that. I will say the ones we visited, there's a lot of parking, and when we pulled in, there's a bunch of empty spots, and you kind of wonder why, and I don't know if there's ever a potential for them to fill a lot. I mean, it's kind of like churches when they build parking. They don't build the parking based on the attendance on Christmas and Easter. They build it based on this is what it's going to be used for, period. But Christmas and Easter, you can't find a parking spot. Any other Sunday, you pull right in and get one. So same way with these. I don't know if necessarily in this reg we need to reinvent the wheel, and they do have that ability to be able to ask for waivers from.
That's fair. Yeah, thank you. All right. All right. Committee members. So now,
and Greg, before he starts, I just want to make sure that I know Bob has to leave at some point, so I just want to make sure that we limit this so that we can make sure if we're going to take a vote today, we're able to do that and have a quorum. So
okay. Yes, sir.
Real quick, Greg. Don Erler, 4005 Old Highway 53. Katie, in response to your question about, we're not talking about buildings, we're talking about buildings full of hazardous materials. So a little different situation on decommissioning. And decommissioning is not a singular activity at the end. It may be going on at all times because they're going to trade these hazardous materials in and out going on. And Ryan went up to Loudoun County. He did not see a hyperscale data center. There are none in Loudoun County. So big difference in what you're considering here relative to the size and magnitude of these things. So, and one point very, very important. Ryan has suggested that these can go into IPD. IPD is light industrial, not I2. So
that is not correct.
Okay.
IPD encompasses everything commercial and everything industrial. So
Okay, so it does cover I2 as well?
it does. You can do anything in IPD that you do in commercial and all industrial sections.
Okay, all right. I need the correction. And anything that you do, please put in adequate review guidelines for yourselves as the Planning Commission, because the Planning Commission really is a critical stop point in all of this activity going on, going forward. Make sure that somebody comes in and proposes a site that you have adequate review. Whether or not it goes to fiscal court or not is another matter, but we've been approving subdivisions in this county by right on agricultural land for 50 years. And to allow data centers to come onto industrial properties by right, I think is a huge step forward and one that's going to be very hazardous for this community going forward. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. All right, commissioners. So now, do you wish to see further revisions, or do you wish to get this moving toward the commission for consideration? And I'll say this, you do not have to provide a recommendation to the commission to either approve or deny. It's just a matter of, do you feel like it's time to get it in front of the commission for consideration, or does it need further scrub here? Is really where we are. Further? Okay.
I think with the significant modifications that we've suggested and talked about, I'd like to see another draft before
Okay.
we present.
All right. You guys good?
Agreed.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think we're getting really close.
We're getting close.
Yeah, but
All right, Ryan. That's our path.
Okay.
Does not need a motion or,
I think it would need a motion if we're ready to advance
if we're going
on
to
this.
pass it.
We're not ready to advance on this, I think is the sentiment of the committee, so. Okay. All right, anything else? Good to the cause? All right, guys. Ryan, enjoy your trip.
Thank you.
We'll stand.